The Hinge law Brisure you have, I suppose, dreamt of finding a single word for designating difference and articulation. I have perhaps located it by chance in Robert S. Dictionary if I play on the word, or rather indicate its double meaning. This word is Brisure ioint, break broken, crack part. Cf. breach, crack, fracture, fault, split, fragment, breche, cassure, fracture, file, fente, fragment. Hinged articulation of two parts of wood or metal work. The hinge, the Brisure folding joint of a shutter. Cf. joint. Roger Laporte, letter, origin of the experience of space and time, this writing of difference, this fabric of the trace, permits the difference between space and time to be articulated, to appear as such, in the unity of an experience, of a semi lived out of a same body proper core proper j. This articulation therefore permits a graphic, visual or tactile, spatial, chain to be adapted, on occasion in a linear fashion, to a spoken, phonic, temporal, chain. It is from the primary possibility of this articulation that one must begin. Difference is articulation. This is, indeed, what Saussure says, contradicting chapter 6, the question of the vocal apparatus obviously takes a secondary place in the problem of language. One definition of articulated language might confirm that conclusion. In Latin, articulus means a member, part, or subdivision of a sequence. Applied to speech language, articulation designates either the subdivision of a spoken chain into syllables or the subdivision of the chain of meanings into significant units. Using the second definition, we can say that what is natural to mankind is not spoken language but the faculty of constructing a language, i.e., a system of distinct signs corresponding to distinct ideas, p26, italics added, p010. The idea of the psychic imprint therefore relates essentially to the idea of articulation. Without the difference between the sensory appearing apparisant J and its lived appearing apparator J, mental imprint, the temporalizing synthesis, which permits differences to appear in a chain of significations, could not operate. That the imprint is irreducible means also that speech is originarily passive, but in a sense of passivity that all intramundane metaphors would only betray. This passivity is also the relationship to a past, to an always already there that no reactivation of the origin could fully master and awaken to presence. This impossibility of reanimating absolutely the manifest evidence of an originary presence refers us therefore to an absolute past. That is what authorized us to call trace that which does not let itself be summed up in the simplicity of a present. It could in fact have been objected that, in the incomposable synthesis of temporalization, protection is as indispensable as retention. And their two dimensions are not added up but the one implies the other in a strange fashion. To be sure, what is anticipated in protension does not sever the present any less from its self-identity than does that which is retained in the trace. But if anticipation were privileged, the irreducibility of the always already there and the fundamental passivity that is called time would risk effacement. On the other hand, if the trace refers to an absolute past, it is because it obliges us to think a past that can no longer be understood in the form of a modified presence, as a present past. Since past has always signified present past, the absolute past that is retained in the trace no longer rigorously merits the name past. Another name to erase, especially since the strange movement of the trace proclaims as much as it recalls, differans differs differs differa. With the same precaution and under the same erasure, it may be said that its passivity is also its relationship with linguistics and grammatology the future. The concepts of present, past, and future, everything in the concepts of time and history which implies evidence of them the metaphysical concept of time in general cannot adequately describe the structure of the trace. And deconstructing the simplicity of presence does not amount only to accounting for the horizons of potential presence, indeed of a dialectic of protension and retention that one would install in the heart of the present instead of surrounding it with it. It is not a matter of complicating the structure of time while conserving its homogeneity and its fundamental successivity, by demonstrating for example that the past present and the future present constitute originarily, by dividing it, the form of the living present. Such a complication, which is in effect the same that Husserl described, abides, in spite of an audacious phenomenological reduction, by the evidence and presence of a linear, objective, and mundane model. Now B would be as such constituted by the retention of now A and the protension of now C, in spite of all the play that would follow from it, from the fact that each one of the three now S reproduces that structure in itself. This model of successivity would prohibit a now X from taking the place of now A, for example, and would prohibit that, by a delay that is inadmissible to consciousness, an experience be determined, in its very present, by a present which would not have preceded it immediately but would be considerably anterior to it. It is the problem of the deferred effect, Nachtraglichkeit, of which Freud speaks. The temporality to which he refers cannot be that which lends itself to a phenomenology of consciousness or a presence, and one may indeed wonder by what right all that is in question here should still be called time, now, anterior present, delay, etc. In its greatest formality, this immense problem would be formulated thus: is the temporality described by a transcendental phenomenology as dialectical as possible, a ground which the structures, let us say the unconscious structures, of temporality would simply modify? Or is the phenomenological model itself constituted, as a warp of language, logic, evidence, fundamental security, upon a woof that is not its own? And which such is the most difficult problem is no longer at all mundane. For it is not by chance that the transcendental phenomenology of the internal time consciousness, so careful to place cosmic time within brackets, must, as consciousness and even as internal consciousness, live a time that is an accomplice of the time of the world. Between consciousness, perception, internal or external, and the world, the rupture, even in the subtle form of the reduction, is perhaps not possible. It is in a certain unheard sense, then, that speech is in the world, rooted in that passivity which metaphysics calls sensibility in general. Since there is no non-metaphoric language to oppose to metaphors here, one must, as Bergson wished, multiply antagonistic metaphors. Wish sensibilized, is how Maine de Byron, with a slightly different intention, named the vocalic word. That the logos is first imprinted and that imprint is the writing resource of language, signifies, to be sure, that the logos is not a creative activity, the continuous full element of the divine word, etc. But it would not mean a single step outside of metaphysics if nothing more than a new motif of return to finitude, of God's death, etc., were the result of this move. It is that conceptuality and that problematics that must be deconstructed. They belong to the ontology they fight against. Difference is also something other than finitude. According to Saussure, the passivity of speech is first its relationship with language. The relationship between passivity and difference cannot be distinguished from the relationship between the fundamental unconsciousness of language, as rootedness within the language, and the spacing, pause, blank, punctuation, interval in general, etc., which constitutes the origin of signification. It is because language is a form and not a substance, p. 169, po. 122 that, paradoxically, the activity of speech can and must always draw from it. But if it is a form, it is because in language there are only differences, p. 166, po. 120. Spacing, note ECE that this word speaks the articulation of space and time, the becoming space of time and the becoming time of space, is always the unperceived, the non-present, and the non-conscious. As such, if one can still use that expression in a non-phenomenological way, for here we pass the very limits of phenomenology. Articulating as spacing cannot occur as such within the phenomenological experience of a presence. It marks the dead time within the presence of the living present, within the general form of all presence. The dead time is at work. That is why, once again, in spite of all the discursive resources that the former may borrow from the latter, the concept of the trace will never be merged with the phenomenology of writing. As the phenomenology of the sign in general, a phenomenology of writing is impossible. No intuition can be realized in the place where the whites indeed take on an importance. Preface to coup d'etat. Asterisk. Perhaps it is now easier to understand why Freud says of the dream work that it is comparable rather to a writing than to a language, and to a hieroglyphic rather than to a phonetic writing. 3D, and to understand why Saussure says of language that it is not a function of the speaker. P. 30, Po 14. // or without the complicity of their authors, all these propositions must be understood as more than the simple reversals of a metaphysics of presence or of conscious subjectivity. Constituting and dislocating it at the same time, writing is other than the subject, in whatever sense the latter is understood. Writing can never be thought under the category of the subject, however it is modified, however it is endowed with consciousness or unconsciousness, it will refer, by the entire thread of its asterisk Mallarmé, T.R. Anthony Hartley, Harman Swarth, 1965, p. 209. Linguistics and grammatology history, to the substantiality of a presence unperturbed by accident, or to the identity of the self-same i.e. proper in the presence of self-relationship. And the thread of that history clearly does not run within the borders of metaphysics. To determine an X as a subject is never an operation of a pure convention, it is ever an indifferent gesture in relation to writing. Spacing as writing is the becoming absent and the becoming unconscious of the subject. By the movement of its drift/derivation derived the emancipation of the sign constitutes in return the desire of presence. That becoming or that drift/derivation does not befall the subject which would choose it or would passively let itself be drawn along by it. As the subject's relationship with its own death, this becoming is the constitution of subjectivity. On all levels of life's organization, that is to say, of the economy of death. All graphemes are of a testamentary essence. 31 And the original absence of the subject of writing is also the absence of the thing or the referent. Within the horizontally of spacing, which is in fact the precise dimension I have been speaking of so far, and which is not opposed to it as surface opposes depth, it is not even necessary to say that spacing cuts, drops, and causes to drop // revealing the unconscious. The unconscious is nothing without this cadence and before the caesura. This signification is formed only within the hollow of difference, of discontinuity and of discreteness, of the diversion and the reserve of what does not appear. This Hinge Brisure of language as writing, this discontinuity, could have, at a given moment within linguistics, run up against a rather precious continuist praejudice. Renouncing it, phonology must indeed renounce all distinctions between writing and the spoken word, and thus renounce not itself, phonology, but rather phonologism. What Jacobson recognizes in this respect is most important for us. The stream of oral speech, physically continuous, originally confronted the mathematical theory of communication with a situation considerably more involved. C.E. Shannon and W. Weaver. The mathematical theory of communication, Urbana, 1949, pp. 74f, 112f, than in the case of a finite set of discrete constituents, as presented by written speech. Linguistic analysis, however, came to resolve oral speech into a finite series of elementary informational units. These ultimate discrete units, the so-called distinctive features, are aligned into simultaneous bundles termed phonemes, which in turn are concatenated into sequences. Thus form in language has a manifestly granular structure and is subject to a quantal description. 32 The Hinge Brisure marks the impossibility that a sign, the unity of a signifier and a signified, be produced within the plenitude of a present and an absolute presence. That is why there is no full speech, however much one might wish to restore it by means or without benefit of psychoanalysis. Before thinking to reduce it or to restore the meaning of the full speech which claims to be truth, one must ask the question of meaning and of its origin in difference. Such is the place of a problematic of the trace. Bhy of the trace? What led us to the choice of this word? I have begun to answer this question. This question is such, and such the nature of my answer, that the place of the one and of the other must constantly be in movement. If words and concepts receive meaning only in sequences of differences, one can justify one's language, and one's choice of terms, only within a topic and orientation in space and an historical strategy. The justification can therefore never be absolute and definitive. It corresponds to a condition of forces and translates an historical calculation. Thus, over and above those that I have already defined, a certain number of givens belonging to the discourse of our time have progressively imposed this choice upon me. The word trace must refer to itself to a certain number of contemporary discourses whose force I intend to take into account. Not that I accept them totally. The word trace establishes the clearest connections with them and thus permits me to dispense with certain developments which have already demonstrated their effectiveness in those fields. Thus, I relate this concept of trace to what is at the center of the latest work of Emmanuel Levinas and his critique of ontology. 33 Relationship to the Aleity as to the aldeity of a past that never was and can never be lived in the originary or modified form of presence. Reconciled here to a Heideggerian intention as it is not in Levinas's thought, this notion signifies, sometimes beyond Heideggerian discourse, the undermining of an ontology which, in its innermost course, has determined the meaning of being as presence and the meaning of language as the full continuity of speech. To make enigmatic what one thinks one understands by the words proximity, immediacy, presence, the proximate proche, the on propre, and the pre of presence, is my final intention. 3 This book. This deconstruction of presence accomplishes itself through the deconstruction of consciousness, and therefore through the irreducible notion of the trace, spur, as it appears in both Nietzschean and Freudian discourse. And finally, in all scientific fields, notably in biology, this notion seems currently to be dominant and irreducible. If the trace, archie-phenomenon of memory, which must be thought before the opposition of nature and culture, animality and humanity, etc., belongs to the very movement of signification, then signification is a priori written, whether inscribed or not, in one form or another, in a sensible and spatial element that is called exterior. Archie-writing, at first the possibility of the spoken word, then of the graphy in the narrow sense, the birthplace of usurpation, denounced from Plato to Saussure, this trace is the opening of the first exteriority in general, the enigmatic relationship of the living to its other and of an inside to an outside, spacing. The outside, spatial and objective exteriority which we believe we linguistics and grammatology 7.1 know as the most familiar thing in the world, as familiarity itself, would not appear without the gram, without difference as temporalization, without the non-presence of the other inscribed within the sense of the present, without the relationship with death as the concrete structure of the living present. Metaphor would be forbidden. The presence absence of the trace, which one should not even call its ambiguity but rather its play, for the word ambiguity requires the logic of presence, even when it begins to disobey that logic, carries in itself the problems of the letter and the spirit, of body and soul, and of all the problems whose primary affinity I have recalled. All dualisms, all theories of the immortality of the soul or of the spirit, as well as all monisms, spiritualist or materialist, dialectical or vulgar, are the unique theme of a metaphysics whose entire history was compelled to strive toward the reduction of the trace. The subordination of the trace to the full presence summed up in the logos, the humbling of writing beneath the speech dreaming its plenitude, such are the gestures required by an ontotheology determining the archaeological and eschatological meaning of being as presence, as parousia, as life without difference, another name for death, historical metonymy where God's name holds death in check. That is why, if this movement begins its era in the form of Platonism, it ends in infinitist metaphysics. Only infinite being can reduce the difference in presence. In that sense, the name of God, at least as it is pronounced within classical rationalism, is the name of indifference itself. Only a positive infinity can lift the trace, sublimate it. It has recently been proposed that the Hegelian Aufhebung be translated as sublimation. This translation may be of dubious worth as translation, but the juxtaposition is of interest here. We must not therefore speak of a theological prejudice, functioning sporadically when it is a question of the plenitude of the logos as the sublimation of the trace is theological. Infinitist theologies are always logocentrisms, whether they are creationisms or not. Spinoza himself said of the understanding or logos that it was the immediate infinite mode of the divine substance, even calling it its eternal son in the short treatise. It is also to this epoch, reaching completion with Hegel, with the theology of the absolute concept as logos, that all the non-critical concepts accredited by linguistics belong, at least to the extent that linguistics must confirm, and how can a science avoid it, the Saussurean decree marking out the internal system of language. It is precisely these concepts that permitted the exclusion of writing, image or representation, sensible and intelligible, nature and culture, nature and technics, etc. They are solidary with all metaphysical conceptuality and particularly with the naturalist, objectivist, and derivative determination of the difference between outside and inside. And above all with the vulgar concept of time. I borrow this expression from Heidegger. It designates, at the end of being and time, a concept of time thought in terms of spatial movement or of the now, and dominating all philosophy from Aristotle's physics to Hegel's logic. 34 This concept, which determines all of classical ontology, was not born out of a philosopher's carelessness or from a theoretical lapse. It is intrinsic to the totality of the history of the Occident, of what unites its metaphysics and its techniques. And we shall see it later associated with the linearization of writing, and with the linearist concept of speech. This linearism is undoubtedly inseparable from phonologism. It can raise its voice to the same extent that a linear writing can seem to submit to it. Saussure's entire theory of the linearity of the signifier could be interpreted from this point of view. Auditory signifiers have at their command only the dimension of time. Their elements are presented in succession, they form a chain. This feature becomes readily apparent when they are represented in writing. The signifier, being auditory, is unfolded solely in time from which it gets the following characteristics. A. It represents a span, and B. The span is measurable in a single dimension. It is a line. 35 It is a point on which Jacobson disagrees with Saussure decisively by substituting for the homogeneousness of the line the structure of the musical staff, the chord in music. 36 What is here in question is not Saussure's affirmation of the temporal essence of discourse but the concept of time that guides this affirmation and analysis, time conceived as linear successivity, as consecutivity. This model works by itself and all through the course, but Saussure is seemingly less sure of it in the anagrams. At any rate, its value seems problematic to him, and an interesting paragraph elaborates a question left suspended, that the elements forming a word follow one another is a truth that it would be better for linguistics not to consider uninteresting because evident, but rather as the truth which gives in advance the central principle of all useful reflections on words. In a domain as infinitely special as the one I am about to enter, it is always by virtue of the fundamental law of the human word in general that a question like that of consecutiveness or non-consecutiveness may be posed. 37 This linearist concept of time is therefore one of the deepest adherences of the modern concept of the sign to its own history. For at the limit, it is indeed the concept of the sign itself, and the distinction, however tenuous, between the signifying and signified faces, that remain committed to the history of classical ontology. The parallelism and correspondence of the faces or the planes change nothing. That this distinction, first appearing in Stoic logic, was necessary for the coherence of a scholastic thematics dominated by infinitist theology, forbids us to treat today's debt to it as a linguistics and grammatology 7.3 contingency or a convenience. I suggested this at the outset, and perhaps the reasons are clearer now. The signatum always referred, as to its referent, to a res, to an entity created or at any rate first thought and spoken, thinkable and speakable, in the eternal present of the divine logos and specifically in its breath. If it came to relate to the speech of a finite being, created or not, in any case of an intracosmic entity, through the intermediary of a signans, the signatum had an immediate relationship with the divine logos which thought it within presence and for which it was not a trace. And for modern linguistics, if the signifier is a trace, the signified is a meaning thinkable in principle within the full presence of an intuitive consciousness. The signified face, to the extent that it is still originarily distinguished from the signifying face, is not considered a trace. By rights, it has no need of the signifier to be what it is. It is at the depth of this affirmation that the problem of relationships between linguistics and semantics must be posed. This reference to the meaning of a signified thinkable and possible outside of all signifiers remains dependent upon the onto theoteleology that I have just evoked. It is thus the idea of the sign that must be deconstructed through a meditation upon writing which would merge, as it must, with the undoing solicitation asterisk of onto theology, faithfully repeating it in its totality and making it insecure in its most assured evidences. 38 One is necessarily led to this from the moment that the trace affects the totality of the sign in both its faces. That the signified is originarily and essentially, and not only for a finite and created spirit, trace, that it is always already in the position of the signifier, is the apparently innocent proposition within which the metaphysics of the logos, of presence, and consciousness, must reflect upon writing as its death and its resource. Derrida comments on this latinate use of solicitation in force et signification, ed. p. 1.3.